Today we're looking at the defence of duress by circumstance and the defence of necessity. The reason that we're going to look at those two together is because they are very, very similar. So let's kick off with duress by circumstance. The case where this defence was invented was the case of Willer in 1986. This concerned somebody who was in their car and was surrounded by a group of people that were quite intimidating. The driver felt that they had no other option but to drive on the pavement to get away from this intimidating crowd that was around their car. In doing so, they did it very carefully. They drove at no more than 10 miles an hour, and they actually drove straight to the police station, where the police promptly arrested them for having driven on the pavement. So they tried to suggest that they had done so under duress, and at that time only duress by threat existed. And if you pause for a moment to think about why that defence wouldn't have succeeded. Hopefully you'll remember that one of the limitations on duress by threat is that there actually needs to be a threat, and that threat needs to have specified what offence the person needs to do. So nobody had actually said to Willer, you need to drive on the pavement or you will get badly hurt. So he was unable to rely on the defence of duress by threat, so the courts made up this new defence, duress by circumstance. And they said if the defendant's in a situation where they believe that themselves or someone with them is going to suffer serious injury or death if they don't escape by doing what they do by committing that crime, then they can use the defence of duress by circumstance. And the criteria for this defence come from the case of Martin. This should sound familiar to you. The case of Martin was a case that we looked at when we did duress by threat. It was the guy whose wife said that she would kill herself if he didn't drive their son to work. So in that case they did come up with the criteria for duress by circumstance, and this is it. So you can see here that the tests that we used for the defence of duress by threat are used within this slightly bigger test. So the Graham test is applied in exactly the same way. Was the defendant compelled to act as he did because he reasonably feared serious injury or death? And also, did he respond as a sober person of reasonable firmness with the characteristics of the defendant react how they would have done? So all of the usual cases that you would have used with duress by threat apply here. Cases like Bowen, which gave us the characteristics in that second objective-ish test. So that's exactly the same as duress by threat. But what's different is that you have this extra bit here. They also need to objectively, as the reasonable person would see it, have been acting reasonably and proportionately to avoid that threat of death or serious injury. This is language that we've heard before when we looked at self-defence. It's very similar language that's being used. So did they do what anyone would think is the right kind of thing to do, and they didn't go too far, is basically what we're asking. So thinking back now to the case of Willer that we looked at a moment ago, in acting to avoid that threat that they felt they were going to get seriously injured by that crowd that was around their car, objectively, would the reasonable person think that it was reasonable and proportionate to drive on the pavement at less than 10 miles an hour very carefully to avoid that threat? And the answer to that is yes, the reasonable person would think that. So they would succeed, as long as they satisfied the Graham test as well, they would succeed and did succeed with the defence of duress by circumstance. However, if they had driven down a very busy high street at 100 miles an hour, weaving around children coming out of school, then that would be unlikely to have been considered proportionate to the threat. Conway is a case that looks a little bit more at that question of what is reasonable and proportionate. And the main thing that comes from this case is that it is a question for the jury to decide. So when you're answering scenarios, you can never really say 100% whether something is reasonable and proportionate or not, because we don't know until it's put to a jury. But what you should say is whether you think it is likely that a jury would find it to be reasonable and proportionate or not. So you can read the facts of Conway here in green, but basically he thought that a couple of people were approaching his car to shoot his passenger, and so when he recklessly drove off at high speed, he was doing something that was reasonable and proportionate to the threat of being shot. And we can see that's slightly different to Willer, because in Willer there was no reason to think that the crowd around the car had weapons. So what would be proportionate in this situation would be different to what would be proportionate in that situation. The case of Cairns confirms what we can see from the case of Conway, really. That is that if the defendant perceives something to be a threat and acts reasonably and proportionately to that perceived threat, then he can use the defence, even if he's making a mistake. So this case, you can read more details if you look in your textbook. Click on the textbook link. But basically it was Cairns was driving his car and the victim jumped onto the bonnet of his car. He saw a group of people, the victim's friends, running towards his car and thought that they were coming to hurt him, basically. So he drove off, and then when he hit a speed bump, the victim came off the car, went under the car and was badly hurt. He was able to claim successfully that he didn't realise that that crowd of people, the friends of the victim, were coming to help and to get the victim off of the bonnet. He thought that they were coming to hurt him. So this case confirmed that it doesn't matter what the truth is, we'll look at what the defendant perceived the threat to be, as long as it's a reasonable perception. If there's no reason to think that at all, then it won't succeed. So now have a look at how you think the jury would decide in this case, the case of Pommel. Decide whether you think, looking at the criteria that we've just explored, whether you think Pommel would or would not be able to use the defence of duress by circumstance. No need to write anything, just read through, look at your criteria and make a decision for yourself. On to some necessity now. like I said at the beginning, this defence is very, very similar to the defence of duress by circumstance. So it's when the circumstances force somebody to act to prevent a worse thing from occurring. In the case of Shayla, the judge actually declared that there is very little difference between duress by circumstance and necessity. He said that the distinction has often been ignored or blurred by the courts. So the criteria that they set out is here, and the first thing here can be summarised as they only did what they did because something worse would happen if they didn't. So they use quite flowery language, inevitable and irreparable evil, but the basic idea is that the consequences would have been really bad had they not done what they did. Secondly, that they didn't go beyond what was necessary to stop that evil. And thirdly, that the bad thing that the defendant has done is much smaller than the huge evil, the terrible thing that would have happened had they just left circumstances to happen as they were. So you can see from the Shayla criteria that it really is similar to duress by circumstance, but the huge difference between the two is that since the case of Re A, the case with the conjoined twins that we have spoken about before, since that case it has been allowed, necessity has been allowed as a defence to a charge of murder, and that is not the case with duress. So consider how the facts of Re A fit with the Shayla criteria. And you might want to pause and have a look at that criteria and read over the case to remember it. It's there in green. It was the conjoined twins, Jodie and Mary. If the doctors separated them, which they wanted to, they knew that Mary would die because she was weaker and relying on Jodie for life. If they didn't separate them, then both twins would certainly die. So the doctors wanted to separate them, but the religious mother did not want the twins separated. She wanted God to be allowed to decide their fate. So looking at the Shayla criteria then, if the circumstances allowed to continue as it is, will a very bad thing happen? And is the separating of the twins necessary to prevent that very bad thing happening? Yes, it is. There'll be the death of two babies. Secondly, was no more done than was necessary, and that is the case here. They would separate them, but not go beyond. Mary would be allowed to die, but not actually actively killed. And finally, the evil of separating them, and basically meaning that Mary was going to die, is that evil lesser than the evil that will occur if they don't separate them? The evil would be both twins dying. And that's why they use that phrase, the lesser of two evils. So Mary dying was considered to be a lesser evil than both twins dying.